Y'all, I hate that we're here. I hate that this is happening. I wish that I had different content for y'all today, but it simply must be done because this book was by far one of the most upsetting and triggering books that I've read in a really long time, and I do not appreciate it. So, hi everyone, it's Natalie, and welcome back to my channel. Today we are talking about The Heart Principle by Helen Hoang. This is the third book in the Kiss Quotient series. It is part of a romance trilogy where we follow different autistic characters throughout the series falling in love. And in this one in particular, we follow Anna, who is a violinist who has recently had a bout of popularity, and that has left her feeling very self-conscious and hyper aware of her ability to play her violin at the caliber that she thinks everyone is expecting her to. And on top of that, she has a boyfriend who she has been in a long-term relationship with, who suddenly asks her to have an open relationship. And this is because he's trying to decide if he wants to commit to marrying her. But in order to do that, he's like, I need to fuck around and find out, and then we can just get together maybe and end up marrying. So she agrees to that, even though she doesn't really want to, and decides to join some dating apps. And in these apps is that she meets Quan, and so they start messaging each other, and sparks start flying. Essentially, not really sparks, they're just like getting along really well. And so they end up setting up a series of one night stands that don't quite work out. And so the story progresses from there. Now, first and foremost, look at this cover. What does this cover say? This cover is like a super intense pink. Like, I don't even know what color to describe it, but it's a very intense pink. It has literally a drawn heart on it. It has the word heart on the title. All of this screams romance. And the fact that it is part of a romance trilogy also screams romance. But is this a romance? No. This is a literary fiction novel trying to masquerade as a romance novel, and it drove me to insanity. So let's talk about it, and let me somewhat recreate my reading experience of this book. So I picked up this book having already watched the book review of Johari's. I will have her linked down below, and her book review of this book linked down below. But I had watched that quite a few months back, so I couldn't remember everything she had said, but I remember her saying that this wasn't really a romance and that it was quite upsetting. But I started the book and I thought I was mentally prepared for that. I was like, okay, it's not really going to be a traditional romance. It's going to have more serious topics. Let's go and do that. The problem here lies in the fact that this tries so hard to stick to narrative structures of a romance novel, while at the same time including deeply upsetting, triggering, and just heartbreaking content that literally blows your mind, basically, or at least it blew mine. Because in essence, this book starts and it reads like a traditional romance. It reads more or less like her previous romance novels in this series. And I was even laughing while I was listening to the audiobook. I was like really vibing with the story. I was enjoying the interactions between Anna and Quan. It was a moment. It really was turning out to be a moment. I was like, yes, great, amazing, iconic. And then part 2 happens and things just completely spiral out of control. In essence, the second part of this book, because it's a book divided into 3 parts, the second part of this book delves completely into her, the protagonist Anna, suddenly having to take on a caregiver role for her father because he has a severe stroke. And so she has to go and essentially live with her parents so that she can help take care of her father, who is now in a very, very weak state and cannot take care of himself. And that second part of the novel literally tried to kill me. Like, I have not read a book that literally made me so mad while at the same time emotionally draining me to the point that literally my chest felt tight. Like, the second day I was reading this book, which is when I read the bulk of the second part of it, I got so mad that I was sending voice messages to one of my friends where I was literally screaming about this book and how much I could not stand the protagonist. And then that devolved into me feeling so emotionally drained by everything this book was making me feel that my chest felt tight, and it took me hours to unwind. Okay, it took me hours to relax and be able to actually go to sleep and not feel like utter shit. It was no. And the third part of the book is just as unsatisfying because it becomes a summary of her life. And it's like, what is this? What is this? This review is going to be all over the place because basically I have ideas of what I want to say, but I didn't write any of it down. And I'm just speaking from my heart. So let's just keep going. So part of the issue I have with this book is that I don't actually think it's a poorly written book. I think that narratively it could have been stronger, because the fact that it starts as a romance and then becomes depressing and then has a short summary at the end, those are weaknesses in writing. Like, this should not have been plotted out the way that it was. Like, it doesn't make sense. But otherwise, it's not actually a bad story. And if this had committed to just being about a realistic depiction of a woman finding out that she has autism, but not revealing that information to most of her family and becoming overwhelmed and essentially spiraling because she's masking all the time, and that is very draining for her. And if it were about her at the same time being overwhelmed because the energy that it takes to be a caregiver is a lot, it's very intense, and her not being able to handle that. If this novel had been about that, it would have been amazing. But the fact that it tried to fit in characters from the previous novels in this series, and the fact that it even tried to be part of this series, is like, why? Why did you make that choice? Because it doesn't make sense. It really does not make sense. And part of what I found so upsetting about this book, and the fact that I couldn't decide if it wanted to be a literary fiction novel about the struggles of being an adult with a recent autism diagnosis and suddenly taking on the role of a caregiver, or choosing to be a romance, part of what messed it up is that this is a book that I was looking forward to because I really liked Quan as a side character in the previous two novels. He was amazing, iconic, incredible, and I was really looking forward to having a romance where he was the love interest. But what actually happens in this novel? One, he falls to the wayside because the narrative is so obsessed with Anna that we can hardly spend any time with him. And two, because we're spending so much time with Anna, but the book is still trying to pretend that it's a romance novel, then he has to be the absolute most fucking perfect boyfriend in order for the romance to actually succeed, because literally he has no room to be imperfect. In a few chapters, we do get to see some of his own personal struggles, and we do get to see his own emotional damage, but ultimately that led to nothing. That didn't lead to tension or conflict in the story. Instead, he was a good little boyfriend and figured out his own feelings and was just completely respectful of Anna's feelings And when she was completely spiraling, he was just there in her corner being perfect and amazing. And I was just like, I love my man Quan, but the fact that he's so perfect is actually the reason why I hate this romance. And not because he's perfect, but because he's so good and so wonderful that the way that Anna treats him makes me boil with rage. It literally made me so angry the way she treated him, because he did not deserve that treatment. If we had seen him as more flawed, maybe I could have been more, okay, they're both kind of being chaotic now. It's fine, we can deal with that. But because he was basically perfect and she was the most imperfect being ever, I could not do it. I could not do it. I was reading the book and I was like, bro, you deserve someone so much better than Anna. And let me just add in here, like, I'm not saying that people who are struggling emotionally and all of that don't deserve love, don't deserve to have a committed partner. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that when you are in an emotionally fraught place where you barely have the bandwidth to deal with your own self, you should understand that you should not be entering into a committed relationship with someone else, because it's not fair to that person. It's not fair to that person because you are in like the bottomest of the bottom. Like, you really literally, because that's where Anna is. Like, she can barely handle herself, and you want to add a man to that equation? No, absolutely not. So that's why I'm saying, like, the problem is not like, oh, mentally ill people, autistic people, or anything like that can't be in loving committed relationships, and people don't exist who are willing to be in those relationships. That's not my point at all, okay? I'm someone with anxiety, okay? And with the nagging suspicion that I'm autistic as well, though I haven't gotten a diagnosis. So my point is not to say that people in those groups don't deserve love. Like, don't get it twisted for a single second. I'm just saying that if you are at rock bottom, maybe jumping into a committed relationship ain't the best thing to do. Isn't the healthiest thing to do, and isn't the most loving thing you could do for that person that you're developing feelings for. That's what I'm saying. So there was that. I'm trying to figure out all the non-spoiler stuff. I really am trying to figure that out because I need to go into spoilers after. So what else happened here? Okay, I guess I can talk about this in broad strokes. So part of the reason why I found Anna infuriating is because she is a people pleaser. And I really struggle reading books from the perspective of characters who are people pleasers. It's very much a struggle for me because usually that means that they're making themselves miserable and someone very important in their lives as well miserable in order to please the majority. And it just aggravates me. It aggravates me so freaking much. Now, I understand that part of that is cultural because that is embedded into the story. Anna talks about I think she's Chinese, don't quote me on that, but she's like the youngest, and so her role in her family is to basically just do what her elders tell her to do. She's supposed to be complacent, she's supposed to be good, she's supposed to not put up a struggle about anything. And I understand that part of that is cultural, but the extent to which she internalized that, and in part also internalized that because she's autistic and has been masking for so long and doesn't know how to be a normal person, quote unquote, drove me to insanity. It really got right under my skin and made me want to chuck this book against a wall. And part of how that comes across and the extreme that she got to, that was really what was annoying to me from the start, was that part of the reason Quan and Anna couldn't have their one night stand was because Anna was unable to tell him what she needs in order to orgasm. she was unable to communicate that. And the reason she was unable to communicate that was because she was so self-conscious about what she needed and was so in her head thinking that it was weird or strange, and also thinking that, like, as a woman she shouldn't talk about sex, and also thinking about how if anyone found out they would think it was weird, that she could not express to this man what she needed sexually. And that was just a limit that I was like, I didn't know I had this limit, but now I know that I cannot deal with that. I'm like, communicate what you need, woman. Especially if it's just that. I'm like, you don't know this man. You can't expect that this man is going to share this information with anyone. Just fucking tell him what you need to get off. Like, she was really testing me. She was really testing me with that bullshit. Okay? So there was that layer of her being a people pleaser. And then things just kind of snowballed. Like, I probably could have been able to process her not being able to do that if that was the main way in which her people-pleasing tendencies interfered with their relationship. But of course it was not. Of course it was not. Of course, since this transitions into her spending so much time with her family, part of what happens is that this keeps snowballing. Things keep adding up and adding up and adding up and adding up and adding up. And so the orgasm stuff became the least of my problems. It really did. It really did. Because she was doing so much other stuff that I could not stand, that overall, I just ended up hating Anna. I hate Anna. Like, I cannot stand her. I physically am literally filled with fury when I think about Anna. Okay? And let me just jump into spoilers, because that's the only way I can explain to you how this snowballed and why it was so upsetting in the long term. So, part of what happens here is that, as I already established, Anna is in a relationship. And once her boyfriend decides to be in an open relationship and she meets Quan and starts liking him, she realizes relatively early on that she doesn't want to go back to being with her boyfriend. She doesn't actually like him. She gets no pleasure from him. There's really nothing between them. But what does Anna do? She does not break up with her man. She stays in this relationship with this man. And what then happens that she goes into her parents' house to start taking care of her father. And so the mother of her boyfriend comes in one day and is all like, oh my God, you're so good at taking care of your father. I would love to have you as a daughter-in-law. And because she's so exhausted and mentally drained from all the effort it is taking her to take care of her father, she doesn't want to deal with breaking up with this man. She doesn't want to deal with this woman. She doesn't want to deal with the fact that her family would be very upset if she broke up with her boyfriend, because he's the perfect boyfriend. He is family approved. So she doesn't want to deal with any of that. So what does she tell this woman? Oh, I would love to be your daughter-in-law. And so what ends up happening after that? They throw a birthday party for her father, the man who is bound to his bed, basically. They throw a birthday party for this man, and at the party, her boyfriend comes over, and he's like, I have an announcement to make. Anna and I are getting married. And, like, apart from the fact that he never actually fucking asked her to marry him, because he literally never proposed, apart from that, what does this woman say because she's at her breaking point? Yes, we are getting married. And of course, Quan is there witnessing that. So not only has she completely denied the fact that she's with Quan and actually genuinely loves him, she has just agreed that she is in a committed relationship with her boyfriend and is about to marry him. All to people please. And then even before that, because like I told you, she realized relatively early on that she didn't actually want to return to her boyfriend, but just didn't want to deal with breaking up with him, didn't want to deal with her family. her family actually meets Kwon, who they immediately don't approve of because he has like tattoos and he runs a fashion brand, and they don't trust basically that he has the resources, you know, to properly take care of her. And he's also like not the right kind of Asian because he's Vietnamese American. And there's all of that, but in essence, when he meets her family, she just leaves it as established that basically he's the fuck buddy. Like, he's not here to stay. She's just here to tap and go, you know? She does actually say that she hasn't had sex with him, but she does basically just leave it at that level where he is just someone that she's messing around with and it's not serious. And later on, she doesn't defend him when her sister starts talking shit about him and the fact that he has a fashion brand. She's like, oh, he basically sells t-shirts from his car, from the trunk of his car, and she cannot stand up for him. She cannot. And you combine her not standing up for Kwon in those moments, and to clarify, he's actually quite successful in his fashion brand. So you mix her not standing up for him there, and then saying to a crowd of people that she's marrying her boyfriend that should be her ex-boyfriend. And I just hate this bitch. I hate her. Like, I understand that she is going through some shit, but that does not change the fact that I violently hate her, okay? And I do not use that word lightly, all right? I don't really talk about hating stuff on this channel or ever, but I hate Anna. I hate her and all of her decisions. So we have that hot mess, and I'm supposed to root for this romance at the end? No. And then the cherry on top of this relationship that I think is toxic and horrible is the fact that in the third part of this book, in essence, we just get a summary of her being depressed, like falling into a deep depression. And Kwon is just there in the background, once again, being the perfect boyfriend, being in her corner, taking care of her, and just becoming irrelevant to the story. And I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. Kwon does not deserve this slander. Like, no. 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 What else did I not like about this? There's literally so much that I could talk forever. I really could because there are so many layers to what I dislike about this. Oh, another of the key things that I dislike about this book is the fact that I should have been able to relate to Anna, but because this was trying to be a romance, I could not relate to her. Instead, I was exasperated by her and her actions and how she was treating Kwon. Like, I, from a relatively young age as a teenager, had to be a caregiver for my mother. So I understand the position that Anna is in. I understand her frustrations at the energy that it takes, the effort that it takes. I understand the desire for it to be over. Like, part of the reason that, where is it? Where do I have it? I can't find it. But one of the reasons I love A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness is because it tackles perfectly in a heartfelt novel that is not trying to be a romance or trying to be cute. In a heartfelt novel, it tackles being a child, seeing your parent being incredibly ill, and living with the emotional turmoil, and in your heart of hearts, part of you being like, I wish they would just die already so we can all be at peace. Like, I understand that feeling perfectly, and I feel like A Monster Calls captures that emotion perfectly. And this one, if it had not been trying to be a romance, could have done that too. okay? It could have done that too. If it had not tried to have a romance, I could have connected to Anna's experience of being overwhelmed by being a caregiver and wanting it all to end. Like, I really could have. But because this tried to put Kwan in there, tried to be cutesy in certain parts, I could not connect to it because her being overwhelmed meant that she made decisions that made me hate her within the context of this being a romance novel or having a strong romance element. So that was also upsetting because I'm like, I would have actually loved to have been able to process those emotions through a fiction novel. You know? Like, I don't mind going through that kind of catharsis. But this one couldn't let go of the idea of being a romance, and it meant that it tried to put so much trauma in this book and then be like, of course we're gonna have a perfect romance in the end. And I'm like, no. You know what this novel could have done? It could have still had a romance, because there's nothing wrong with being a literary fiction novel that has strong romance elements and a romance subplot. There's nothing wrong with that. But you know what this could have been? It could have completely sacrificed the cutesy ass shit. It could have actually been a realistic depiction of how challenging this relationship would have realistically been if we got equal amounts of the perspective of both Anna and Kwan. Because I can promise you that Kwan was struggling being in this relationship, and the fact that none of that is presented and instead he's just relegated to being perfect is the problem here. Because instead, if we had seen the struggles from both of their sides, then this could have been just a very raw and realistic depiction of trauma and what trauma does to you and how you try to navigate that shit when you are in a relationship. But no, we couldn't do that. So instead, the author fucking disrespected me by imbuing a romance book that literally tries to follow the narrative arc of a romance book with so much trauma that I was drained and upset and couldn't even calm down after reading the book. Actually, not even after reading the book, while I was reading it. And because it was following a narrative arc of a romance, I could not put down the fucking audiobook, because I have this problem that part of why I enjoy romances and why they're so compulsively readable for me is because I know what to anticipate. And sometimes when I'm frustrated with something going on in the narrative, what I do is just push through it and rush through it so that I can get to the point where it gets resolved, because I know for a fact that it's going to get resolved. So that's what happened with this book, and I shouldn't have done that. But because it was trying to be a romance, I did it to my own detriment. And that is that because I knew that at some point Anna was going to reach her breaking point and would stop trying to be such a people pleaser, I pushed through all of the abuse, all of the trauma, all of the conflict going on in her life, and I did not take breaks to process all the shit she was going through. And so I just zoomed through it. And by the end, I was so emotionally exhausted that in my heart of hearts, I probably could have set this book on fire for everything it made me go through. And lo and behold, what did in fact happen, I zoomed through it and we did get that scene that I knew was going to happen, where she would realize that she shouldn't put herself through all of this for her family when her family doesn't even respect her, acknowledge her challenges, or anything. Like, as I predicted, it happened, because again, it's trying to be a romance. And it's just no. No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I know this has like a 4-point star average on Goodreads, and I don't fucking know how. My only guess is that the people picking up this book are so not part of the romance community that they don't care that how much trauma was in this book. That's the only thing I can assume. I can only assume that they're not as committed in the romance genre, so they don't have the expectations of the genre as cemented in their mind. So they're like, oh, this deviated into this? Cool. And good for them, but I'm not that bitch. I'm really not. And so I hate that I read this. I hate that I couldn't keep myself from just zooming right through it. And I genuinely wish I could give this like 1 star, but I can't even in good conscience do that because I don't think it's a bad book. I don't think it's a bad book. I just think that it should have been a standalone. It should have been its own independent novel that she wrote to focus on having a late diagnosis and being a caregiver. There's one. And it should have not had a traditional romance like this was trying to do. It should not. Kwon should not have been here. Kwon should not have had anything to do with this. Kwon should have had his own romance where he's dealing with his own stuff and falling in love. But being in this hot fucking mess is not where he should have been. Because it just doesn't wrap up the series in any cohesive way or pleasant way or satisfying way. So I don't even know if I have anything else to say. Oh! I remembered one more thing. The final nail in the coffin is that Anna was so horrible to Kwon, and her apology to him was quite frankly offensive. With everything that this woman put this man through, if I had been Kwon, I would have wanted this woman on her knees begging for me to take her back. Okay? Begging for me to take her back. All right. What she actually does to apologize? No, I would not have accepted it. Ultimately, y'all can read this if you want, I guess. You probably won't actually find it as upsetting as I did. Probably. Like my friend Steph from Coffee Over Apples said, this is the kind of book that could actually really live its best life if it had trigger warnings. Like, I'm usually not the type to be easily triggered. I'm really not. That's why most of the time I don't actually look up triggers in books. But I actually genuinely appreciate in romance books having trigger warnings. Because when I go into a romance book, I'm here to have a fucking good time. Okay? I'm not here to relive my trauma or go through the trauma of a character. I'm really not. I'm really fucking not. So this probably could have saved me a lot of anguish if it had just had trigger warnings about it dealing with a super abusive family, dealing with the main character being overextended and overwhelmed and essentially having a breakdown, having autism burnout, or what, I can't remember the official term, but burnout. If it had the trigger warning of depression and suicide ideation, probably I could have walked into this book more prepared for what it actually was. But since that did not happen, since this cover was created for it, since the decision was made to make this part of a romance series that before this point was not traumatizing or upsetting, we reach this point. Where I feel triggered by a book, which almost hardly ever happens. So I don't know what to tell y'all anymore. I'm gonna stop talking about this book. I'm gonna stop because this has already gone on for a very long time, and it's a video that's not even gonna make freaking sense if you haven't read this book, because I was all over the place. But that's it for this review. I'm not rating this book. You can do whatever you want with it. If you loved it, honestly, good for you. I love that energy for you, but this was not for me. It was not. it was not, and I'm just gonna have to live with that. So thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you would like to follow me on any of my social media, I will have the links to that down below in the description. But for now, see you next time.